Hello and welcome to the Slavic Podcast, Episode 3. Today's conversation is with former SUNY Oneonta President, Dr. Alan Donovan. Dr. Donovan was president for 20 years and retired in 2008 after a glorious trip to Russia, Siberia, to be more precise. So I want to begin our conversation, first of all, by thanking you for coming in here today. Hi.
I am very pleased to be talking with both of you.
Thank you. For the listeners who are not familiar with the topic of our conversation, our podcast is usually discussing Russia and politics, culture, education, more about education, and I think it is a relevant angle to learn that our SUNY Oneonta, then college, now university, had a long-standing program with one of the biggest and most advanced universities in Russia. SUNY Oneonta had a relationship with the then Siberian Aerospace University in Krasnoyarsk, Russia. So, Dr. Donovan, how did the program with the then named Siberian Aerospace University begin, and how long did it last?
Well, our program began with the interest of two of our faculty, Dr. Richard Insigna and Dr. Robert Rothenberg. And I think Dr. Insigna had done some research with one of our contacts at the Aerospace University. It was funded in the late 1990s with a grant from the USIA, United States Information Agency, which, by the way, ceased being at the end of the 1990s. It was defunded, and it had been part of the State Department. So the whole program, with exchanges and other kinds of cultural interfaces, lasted for about 15 years.
Thank you for answering that very basic question. I should have known that because at some point I was also part of it.
Yes, you were.
So besides me and you, obviously, who else was involved in this program from SUNY Oneonta?
Well, I can't name all the names, but I would say that easily a half dozen or more people traveled to the Aerospace University in order to teach or give counseling. The reason why Dr. Insigna and Dr. Rothenberg were involved is because it was their intention, and in fact it did happen, to help the Aerospace University get European Business School accreditation, which happened shortly after, not too long after they started working with them.
So anyone else from Oneonta took part in the program?
Well, I think you did. I think Yolanda Sharp went there for the art department. I think a gentleman named Bill O'Day in the business department went there to teach. I think even one of our great academic advisors, Eileen McClafferty, went there to help with their advising system.
What I meant to ask was anyone outside of the college, then college, outside of SUNY Oneonta, if I remember correctly, the former mayor also played a role?
Mayor Kim Muller was part of our delegation in 2008, and I think she was there kind of as being the sister city of Krasnoyarsk, which is much bigger, as we'll find out, and was connected with the mayor of Krasnoyarsk.
So she worked with the mayor and probably contributed to the relationship overall. Quite different sizes, I should say. You know, Oneonta is a small university town. Krasnoyarsk is a larger industrial city, but it also is home for the Siberian Aerospace University. First of all, before we even get to the university part in Russia, what other delegations went back and forth, and for what purpose?
Well, I can't really remember the number necessarily, but the idea was to have cultural exchange between and among similar institutions. That was the whole point of USIA. And so we did have at least 3 or 4 delegations coming to SUNY Oneonta from the Aerospace University. And then in turn, I think there were 2 or 3 delegations that went to Krasnoyarsk from SUNY Oneonta. I remember one time that we had the choir from the music school at the Aerospace University. They were very sensational, and they actually sang all over the place. Sang on campus, they sang at the First United Methodist Church, they sang at the Autumn Cafe, It was a wonderful exchange, and they had a wonderful time. And then some of the leadership came over the years. Dr. Belyakov, who was the rector of the university, our friend Vladimir Kurashov, who now is the vice rector of what is now Aerospace University. He was here several times, as well as some of the other deans.
So when we say rector, back in the Soviet Union, it's the same as president.
I believe so, yes. Yes.
I know so. They don't call anybody president because that's a formal and not so effective term back in the Soviet Union was. But rector is sort of a European name, I think. But it has sort of a religious sound to it.
Well, in Russia, sometimes the presidents turn into much more than a president. They turn into dictators.
Yes. And back in Armenia, they're not as influential as the prime ministers in some countries.
Correct.
So back to our delegations. I understand that the relationship with Russians was very cordial, very informative. Can you elaborate a little bit on your interactions with people in Krasnoyarsk?
Well, it was interesting that we had two academic institutions, so they were familiar with academic life, as well as some of the curricular programs and the academic specialties that we had. It worked out very well. We found the Russians to be very cordial, to be very open, and we enjoyed their company a whole lot. We found them to be, I guess you could say, regular folks with the same aspirations and challenges that people have all over the world.
I would say as one of them were more regular than you would think. More. I remember you mentioned the choir. One of their singers, an amazing tenor, I think, a very, very bright young man. On the day when the choir was leaving Morris Hall, he was still in bed. He just refused to go with the rest of them. I bet he wanted to stay in America, and especially in Oneonta. Do you remember that?
Well, not telling tales out of school, but the night before was the last night that this delegation stayed. And they were staying in Morris Hall, and somehow they discovered or were led to a lot of extra wine that was left over from different kinds of parties. So I'm sure that they stayed out very late, and this young man was part of that. But you're right. I can remember that they were leaving to go down to some visitation in New York City, and he came out and smoked a cigarette and then went back to bed. So he did keep them waiting, no question about it.
A singer smoking a cigarette.
Yep.
Speaking of wine, we were treated with a lot of vodka when we were there, and I just want to start with the beginning of our trip. We will talk about Krasnoyarsk a bit later, but we landed in Russia with a major jet lag, and the first thing they did with us, 7 a.m., they treated us to vodka and cherries. Cherries the size of plums in Siberia. Do you remember?
Well, before we even get there, let's mention where Krasnoyarsk is.
Yes.
Krasnoyarsk is about 2,000 miles east of Moscow. And remember, as I'll mention later on, that Russia, the Soviet Union, had 11 time zones. That's how big it was. So we landed first in Moscow, had to transfer, and then landed in Krasnoyarsk early in the morning, as I recall. So we were a little jet-lagged, to say the very least. The Russians had a wonderful way of greeting us with things like bread and salt, I think was part of the greeting. But certainly the vodka was there, too. Needless to say, most of us who were smart didn't have much to drink because we were pretty tired.
Bread and salt is a very culturally appropriate way of greeting. It's a traditional ritual. Women dressed in traditional clothing,
Yes,
they hold towel, a dish towel that's called rushnik. It's white with embroidery, red usually, featuring birds and flowers. And on that beautiful ruchnik towel, they put a big loaf of bread. Not a loaf, maybe a big round, what do you call it?
A loaf.
A loaf, okay, a round loaf. On top of that loaf, a small container with salt, because you can actually eat bread and salt and be healthy.
I think when we arrived at the university, we were greeted by several of the young women in their ethnic dance costumes. I don't think they danced for us, but it was a wonderful greeting after having met some of the officials at the university earlier at the airport.
Just give it a few years, and I think we will remember somebody dancing, for sure. There were dances.
You know, we danced the last night we were there.
We did. And at the party. So the party was to celebrate the birthday of Krasnoyarsk,
Yes.
the big city. So first of all, anything else about Krasnoyarsk that you want to share?
Well, Krasnoyarsk, when I talk about it being a sister city, it really is not a sister city in terms of size.
It's a big sister.
Right now, Krasnoyarsk is probably 1.1 million. So it's a little bigger than Oneonta. And it was maybe slightly less when we were there in 2008, but not very much. So it's the second largest city in Siberia. It is on the Yenisei River, and I'll mention that in a minute, which flows north to the Arctic Circle. And it is an important junction for the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The author Chekhov judged Krasnoyarsk to be one of the most beautiful cities, maybe in Russia, but certainly in Siberia.
That's wonderful. You mentioned Yenisei. The other large river in Russia, in Siberia, is Lena. And so when they talk about them, they say it's Prince Yenisei because it's the name of a prince. And Lena is the Russian diminutive form for Yelena. The two big rivers, Lena and Yenisei.
Well, interestingly enough, the Yenisei flows north, which is not necessarily the usual course of rivers in the world. And they built on that river, upstream from Krasnoyarsk, a concrete gravity dam that was huge, and we had a chance to see that in operation. That generated a lot of electricity, and at the time we were there, I think they were running an aluminum factory. And in Russia, during World War II, the Russians moved a lot of their plants and entities to the east to be preserved from the Nazis.
So how about the university?
Well, the university, as I recall, was not dissimilar from what we had back then and even now. In other words, they had a school of business, they had a school of music and art, they had a school of, I would call, human ecology. They had kind of liberal arts type of school.
I think arts and liberal arts. There was no communication, no department for media. It was all within business.
Right. So you taught business communication?
I did teach media writing, which is now media writing. Back then it was writing for radio, TV, and film. And I think public speaking, basically, it was how to speak English well.
And that was part of their business program, perhaps?
It was. Those were the only overlaps we could find, because here at Oneonta, our public speaking class is required for some business programs in the what was then School of Business. And our media writing is a general education class that all business students also, they should be taking. And they also have their own business writing. Here at Oneonta, there is a business writing class, but media writing also contributes to a good business way of thinking. And naturally, it was all in English. The instruction was held in English for English-speaking professors who went from here, faculty members like Theron Verdon. Back then, it was Yolanda Sharp, you mentioned. I don't know if she taught. She was probably more engaged with arts and singing.
Yes, she was, yes.
Isabella Lokshina.
Yes. I think when we were there in 2008, there was one of our faculty who was teaching rhetoric or business speech.
We had two faculty. Theron Verdon from my department, one of our faculty members, he volunteered because he has great interest in Russia. And we also took along a young lawyer, Magdalena Lawrence, ethnically, originally from Poland, who moved here to America with her family, and she went to law school. She just volunteered. I think she answered an ad and joined Theron. on that trip and remarkably assimilated very quickly, found her way around the stores and transportation because it is a city. But then Magda joined the business program here as their internship coordinator, and now she lives in Germany, and so does Theron.
Yes. Well, going back to remember how it started, the idea was to help them get their accreditation in the European version of a business school accreditation that was very important to them, which I think they eventually did. Perhaps not happened when we were there, but certainly afterward.
So what has changed since 2008? That was the year, the summer when we went, and I think it was June, mid-June, early June, we left for Krasnoyarsk. How has the Siberian Aerospace University, I'll mention one change that you brought up in an earlier conversation. You mentioned that it's now called Reshetnev University, but as I recall, it already carried the name of Reshetnev, who was very well-known scientist in Russia, and he was actually moved as one of the luminaries during the war, moved to Siberia for safety.
I think the change was coming even at the point when we were there in 2008. It may have happened shortly after that visit. What happened is that the university became much more applied. I'm not sure whether the schools that existed then exist now. And they're much more involved in research involving ballistic missiles for submarines, satellite systems, telebroadcasting, and things like that.
And you know this how?
Well, I tried to find out information about the university through their webpage, but a lot of their sites were blocked. Not everything was blocked, but a lot of their sites were blocked. So I can understand, given the circumstances now, why that's the case. But there still was enough to understand what they're doing, what the change was, as I can understand it.
I also want to remind our listeners, and you in particular, Dr. Donovan, that you were given a honorary degree from Krasnoyarsk, then Siberian Aerospace University, and that could have been the key to insider information because now you were actually named as one of them. Was that, remember there was a ceremony they gave you a symbolic degree?
Yeah, and my picture's hanging somewhere there, at least it was the last time I knew.
Unless it has a little bug in it, I don't think it gives you much access to secret ballistic information.
No, it doesn't.
So
the interesting thing is that we actually have had an astronaut graduate from SUNY Oneonta. His name is Ron Garan.
Mm-hmm.
I think they would have liked to have had something like that, but I'm not aware that they did. They did have some satellites that had been used before and were on the roof of one of the buildings we visited, but they didn't have the kind of fame that we got by having this astronaut graduate from here.
I remember that roof/greenhouse. We went upstairs, and there it was all washed in sunlight, and there was this old capsule. We walked into it, but they also grew nice plants because why not? Siberia is Siberia. They don't get too much sunlight, and here they have a roof. So tell us more about the 2008 Oneonta delegation and who was part of it.
There were, as I recall, 4 of us. There was myself, my wife Annie, you, and then Kim Muller, who was then mayor of the city of Oneonta.
And what was the special occasion for the city of Krasnoyarsk in 2008? We know that you were invited to be awarded that honorary degree, and that was a nice celebration, very cordial, very memorable on stage.
Yes.
That was the ceremony. But how about the mayor's celebration of Krasnoyarsk?
Krasnoyarsk was celebrating the 380th anniversary of their beginning as a city. So it was a very important occasion for them, and I think pretty soon they'll be celebrating the 400th anniversary before too long. So they had a long, actually a 3-hour parade with different groups from all over the central part of Siberia, and it's an amazing mix of ethnic groups that were there. We were asked, did we want to march in the parade? And we said yes. So we chose to travel lightly, and we took was essentially cowboy outfits. We got straw hats, we had bandanas, we had boots, and we got there and discovered that the parade and the academics in the parade were much more elegantly dressed. They actually had academic gowns trimmed in ermine and things like that. But we managed to walk along, and I think people knew we were Americans when they saw the outfit. Yeah. One of the deans, Drozdov, I think his name was, it was his last name, who was a Cossack, he actually marched with us. He had a bandana on, and he'd bought himself a cap gun, which he shot from time to time. But I never took the bandana off, so I don't think he wanted people to know that he was marching with us. But it was a beautiful and very stunning parade, no question about it.
Speaking of their costumes, I remember very vividly Russian Siberian police women wearing uniforms that included skirts.
Yes.
High heels,
yes.
Of course, and stockings with one seam on the back, perfectly lined.
Well, the seam on the back of the stocking goes back to the stockings in World War II, about the time of World War II. And I think they were the only stockings you could get.
Right. They didn't make them whole. They had to stitch them. So,
well, I think they look very smart, to tell you the truth.
Any woman who can walk and be a police officer wearing high heels, I say they're smart.
Yes.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
So how about working with the business department with the Siberian Aerospace University's accreditation? You mentioned that. Did it come to a successful conclusion?
It did, as far as I know. I know that Vladimir Kurashov and Dr. Insigna had done research projects together, and that you can kind of still access, I believe, even if you can't find other information about the university as renamed. So that's how it started, and I think that was one of the successes that we had.
Okay, so the other thing, the obvious change, you mentioned that their school started changing even when we were there. They had a 5-year system of education, which I also did back home. But knowing how their students might want to go to Europe and America for further education, they thought that they might want to bring it closer, make it more similar to our 4-year system for a baccalaureate, and then introduce the master's, which actually was already happening, but the magistrate, as they call it, it's added to the 5 years in some countries. So do you think they ever did that? And was that one of the reasons why they stopped being active in our exchange program?
Well, I think what happened is that there was more central control from Moscow being exercised. And I remember talking with some of the leaders of the institution. We were taking a Russian bath, and talking about some of the changes that were coming. And they were, I think, kind of nervous about what was going to happen to their university. And since you can't really access the site now easily to find out, I imagine that what they were nervous about actually came to happen.
So just full disclosure, I was not present at that bath ceremony. Among other things, it's a very gender-specific culture.
Yes.
They don't mix women and men in a sauna, much unlike other North European countries like Finland, which is neighboring Russia, where men and women go to their bathhouses together. So we did a lot of good travel. I know I gained a lot of weight from eating all the good food, which is very atypical of
Right.
Siberia. But how do you feel about the trip in general?
Well, I think it was a wonderful experience. And by the way, that was the second trip that I had made. I'd made a trip earlier to Siberia. And I think Kim Muller was with us at that point in time, as I recall. And it wasn't for any great celebration. It was just kind of get acquainted. We took a trip on the Sea on a yacht, actually more like a barge, with a number of Russian colleagues. And Russian like to sing a lot. They have very good choirs and do a lot of singing. They sang some of their songs, and then they asked us to sing some songs. And of course, we've been drinking, and the only song I could think of was Jingle Bells. Hardly a great kind of song to sing, but very, very nice and open, cordial, showing us dachas and things like that were on the river, getting us to know their way of life and enjoying the camaraderie.
Now that you mentioned Yenisei River and floating down the river, I remember the nature because it was summer, June. It was the best season to be there, and
Yes.
ticks were alive, so we were warned of ticks. I also remembered one of our own faculty back then, Tracy Allen, who's now Dean of Sciences
Yes,
here at
yes.
SUNY Oneonta. He traveled alone to teach, and he was so brave that he went into the taiga, the Russian forest, and I think he got bitten by a tick, and he was not frazzled by it. He just came right back and sought the medical attention, and I don't think it ever stopped Tracy from going to the Arctic, to Siberia, to any unknown country and just be the bravest person, the bravest explorer as a geographer.
Well, Tracy Allen would show up everywhere he went with just a backpack, and he went everywhere. I'm sure he went to the depths of the Amazon and the heights of the Himalayas and things like that. He's an amazing traveler.
Glaciers, too.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
He's an amazing traveler, and he was our dean for a while, and I have only warm
Yes.
memories of that collaboration.
And a great instructor, too.
Very great instructor. So nature, ticks, one thing, but there were amazing flowers. There is a rare flower called žarki. It's translated as flames because it has a bright color, and they were rare and I think nearly extinct, protected. But the other flower that really captured my attention was the wild peony. It grows wild. Peonies are coming from the Siberian taiga and that region, north of China. And you don't see it here. They're not fluffy, they're not multi-petal like the roses here, but just one single round of petals, beautiful flowers growing wild. And so if I can find a picture, I'll attach it to this podcast so that our listeners can see.
Just one comment about the environment. The only comparison I could think of to the taiga would be northern Alaska, where you have all this wonderful land, acres and acres and thousands of miles of open space, forested and things like that. And that would describe a lot of what surrounded Krasnoyarsk.
And I just heard recently, actually yesterday, I heard that Russia has opened up borders with China with no visas required. But back then in 2008 when we were there, I remember a gentleman from the mayor's office who was quite friendly and very, very cordial. He said that they travel to China just as tourists for work maybe, for trade, they go shopping. And it's close. You don't realize that China and Siberia are sharing a long border, and tigers, maybe. The endangered Ussurian tiger.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining this podcast. It's been very fascinating. It's given me a chance to look back and have some fond memories of travels with colleagues and understanding a culture other than ours and how warm it was back in the spring of 2008.
Thank you for listening. Join us again next time on our Slavic Podcast.